It's the week ending Saturday the 2nd of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a deadly polar vortex bring temperatures in Chicago down to -30, Jeremy Corbyn meeting Theresa May to discuss Brexit, and Ariana Grande revealing a Japanese tattoo that translates as small charcoal grill. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Hollie, Clemence, Tait, and Arion McNicoll. And Hollie, you get to start the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Can anything bring Italy's villages back to life?
You didn't have electricity for the first
year.
Yeah. What did you do? Use?
Disaster, because there was a small panel on the top of the roof, but it was good only for one light. And then Paula was with the computer out in the field with the stick to get connection to send in an email. And I was from here to the other village. Fortunately, there was electricity point in the other village, it's 200 meters. There was a fridge there, so in the morning I was there to take things to have a breakfast.
That was Maurizio Cesprini speaking this week to faircompanies.com about his family's recent move to a ghost town. Hollie, what's going on here?
So this couple have rebuilt a ruined home in the Italian village of Gesio, and they and their son are the only 3 residents in the village, and they're encouraging other young families to follow in their steps and help revive the country's ghost towns.
Okay, sounds like a good episode of Escape to the Country. Why is it your story of the week?
Well, this week, a mayor in Italy in another village has offered to pay €9,000 to families willing to take up residency in his alpine village, and you can move there, providing you have a child and a minimum annual salary of €6,000.
Amazing. This is like a mashup of the stories from last week regarding the Chinese government paying women to take dating leave and Jamie Timpson's theory about rural villages being deserted. Maybe this is the solution we all needed.
It's the latest in a string of offers from Italian towns trying to repopulate or keep their communities going. There's an estimated 20,000 ghost towns in Italy, which is a huge amount. In the last 30 years, 1 in 4 small communities have become ghost towns. And it's quite an interesting concept. Moving on from what Jamie was saying, what are we going to do when everyone starts moving towards the cities? Are there just going to be empty villages and towns? Is there anything we can do? Looking at Italy, you can see what they have been doing. They've been offering houses for €1. Some people have taken entire towns over and turned them into hotels. They've been encouraging people to come and study them. There's lots of ways around it, but it's not necessarily working.
Arion, this seems like a particularly kind of Italian problem, though, these historic villages being deserted, and also quite an Italian solution, which is chucking around a load of the state's money. I mean, do you think it would happen here?
Maybe. You sort of feel as though one of the reasons that they're trying to keep these villages alive is because they're so beautiful to look at. You know, the buildings are old and listed, and with a little bit of love and attention, they could be brought back to being something that is not only a functioning community, but also a part of the tourism experience. You know, whenever you go to Italy, one of the lovely things to do is to drive out into the countryside and see these little hilltop towns or whatever. I don't know if the solution is necessarily going to work. It does seem like there's no amount of money that you could necessarily pay a lot of people to go into the middle of nowhere and try and start their life from scratch.
Except technology correspondent Tait. Presumably, if you're working remotely, I mean, I know we were just hearing that chap talk about the problems of Wi-Fi connectivity out there, but, you know, thinking not too far down the track, you might as well work very remotely, mightn't you? You might as well work somewhere beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, this is a story that very much has its pros and cons. And the pros are that if you are, thankfully, particularly in where we are now and where we'll be going in the next 10 years, the chance of working remotely will become increasingly more possible. I mean, luckily we can do it as journalists because we have to write and then we upload stuff. But I think you'll see it much more in other industries. And therefore, technically, you could go and do it. And if you are from England, you're not on a massive time difference either. However, yes, Wi-Fi problems are going to be a huge concern, particularly in that area. And even if you did establish a Wi-Fi connection, if it goes down, you're in a very remote area and getting it fixed could take weeks to get done.
And you were saying, Hollie, that it hasn't really been working in Italy. What's the backlash been?
It has worked for some villages, but not all of them. And this sort of gimmick of selling for €1 only goes so far if you realise you've got to actually put a lot of investment in to redo the houses. I think they need to go back to basics and make sure the infrastructure's there. Some of these villages are kind of crumbling, the soil's corroding, they're not in the best of places. They've seen earthquakes or floods. People haven't lived there for 50 years or more. So it's not just a case of having a nice village to live in. You might not have access to water or electricity or hospitals. Schools is another thing. The village that we were talking about that are offering €9,000 has got a diminishing school, so obviously they're facing a shutdown if they can't find enough pupils to go there. But that is a problem if you do have children there. You'd have to travel quite far to get education, all the basics of life that you need, which face anyone that lives in a remote area like that.
I do wonder as well, we talk on this show sometimes quite critically of the British culture of investing in property, for example, that everyone sees themselves as wanting to get on a property ladder and make money out of property. That's a problem in many ways for a lot of people in this country who cannot get on that housing ladder. But actually, maybe this is the flip side of that coin. You look at Italy, which doesn't have that culture at all. Lots of people rent. Property isn't something you invest in. And actually, you look at a historic village like this, if something like that existed in the Cheltenham countryside, an entrepreneur would come and pimp it up and sell it on. That hasn't been happening.
Yeah, you're right. And it sort of feels like you could solve a bunch of problems with this really basic solution. I'm sure there's very good reasons why you couldn't necessarily. But for example, Britain is suffering from a great deal of homelessness. Simultaneously, there's a huge, massive migration going from Africa up into Europe. You sort of feel like there should be this intuitively simple solution that, you got empty houses? We've got people who need empty houses. But of course, it isn't that straightforward. And I think all of the reasons that Hollie says about these towns not being functioning places in the first place is one of the main sort of barriers to getting people into these deserted country towns.
Yeah, especially when you actually look at the houses with them going for, let's say, €1. I mean, you have to do so much work to go and get them repaired. But a lot of people are kind of estimating that it would take about €75,000 to get a house functioning, which is a hell of a lot cheaper than buying a house, obviously, in London or in our nearby friends of Surrey. But then you have all of the problems of the infrastructure. And even when they're saying, we've got local towns, we've got local shops, and we've got a school, they're all not going to be in a great state either, you wouldn't think. You wouldn't be able to go down, let's say, to the shop and go and buy a 65-inch OLED TV. Well, that's what I would be concerned with.
That's your priority there.
That's my priority.
It's the classic final piece in any historic Italian village, isn't it?
I also wonder whether it's kind of trying to find a solution to a problem that actually isn't going to be solved so simply. Obviously, people are moving towards big cities, and that's because where opportunities are. The future of employment has historically been moving in one direction, and that's away from the sort of agricultural rural world towards settled larger urban centres. So, you have opportunities that get related to particular places. Houston in the United States is good for energy jobs, San Francisco for technology, New York for business and finance. Similarly, in Europe, you've got London is good for finance, Berlin for manufacturing. These are where the opportunities are, and you can't just artificially keep places alive when there's no work to do in those places.
Well, if you're a feline vet, there's probably quite a lot of work to do in rural Italy, in my experience. But maybe no one's paid
and
for it.
in Greece.
I suppose that might be an issue.
There's an interesting anomaly just talking about that, because the statistics were saying in America it's gone from 72% rural population in 1910 to around 16% over a century, which is exactly what Arion's saying. But in China, there's this kind of opposite, where they've got ghost cities because they've kind of been too quick to urbanise, and then they've been left with massive cities without any people in, which I think is really interesting as well.
And you see that in the Middle East, don't you? In places like Oman and Dubai, which you've only got things that are 10 years old and they're deserted.
Completely. You've just got to kind of keep up with what people actually want. And I guess, like you say, Arion, maybe you can't control what people want if that is where they need to be for employment, or that's where kind of culture's taking them. Maybe there is nothing that we can do about the world turning into rural ghost towns.
But then you were talking about the obvious opportunity of tourism, making these places fit for people to come and enjoy historic Italy. The Italian approach to that at a state level has been at odds with that idea, hasn't it? There have been people, as we've talked about on this show previously, complaining about huge cruise ships coming into Venice and destroying the history. There have been preservation orders on local culinary traditions to make sure that the true Italian food continues to be produced. There's a small c conservative element to all of that, which doesn't really correspond with the idea of let's rent out everything on Airbnb.
Yeah, I think bureaucratically as well, there's a lot of challenges of ticking all the boxes to actually rebuild any houses. There's a guy that's turned one village into a hotel and has it as a wedding venue, but he's done it really beautifully. He's kept all the buildings intact. So I think there's ways around it. But also, like you said, I love this idea of putting kind of housing migrants and homeless people there, but politically in Italy that is not going to work either. It's kind of a climate of fear for migrants.
Not really
there.
The policy they're looking for at the moment. Yeah.
So one of my favourite solutions to the problem came from the southern Italian village of Celia, where the local mayor, a guy called Davide Zucchinella, published a decree which forbade locals from dying or falling ill.
Sounds sensible. Okay, Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I'm wondering whether this week the forever war will finally come to an end.
The results of the talks of the recent days are significant in several respects. First of all, it's the clearest sign yet of U.S. intent to withdraw forces from Afghanistan. Secondly, this is the first time that the U.S. has been willing to be seen openly and publicly as negotiating face-to-face with the Taliban and putting the question of the American troop presence front and center. It's also, I think, significant in that showing the possibility of achieving some progress, of actually having a negotiating process, may have bought Ambassador Khalilzad some time from a very impatient Washington. But there's a lot that remains to be seen on whether this really leads to a sustained peace process.
That was Laura Miller of the International Crisis Group speaking to PBS NewsHour this week. And Arion this week did see the very real possibility of the end of the war in Afghanistan. It's a proper news story you've chosen, but it will have passed a lot of people by. So what happened?
Yeah, so on Monday, US officials and the Taliban representatives who have been negotiating together in Qatar agreed in principle a framework for a peace deal. So, there's a lot of caveats here, but it does look like it's a step towards a breakthrough that could bring to an end this 17-year war that the US has been fighting in Afghanistan.
And I think it's fair to say has lost, effectively, isn't it? I mean, if they're talking to the Taliban, that's very much at odds with the original rhetoric of we will kill the Taliban.
Well, it's a complicated picture because in the early days, the Taliban really were driven out post the US invasion in 2001. But in the intervening years, the Taliban have gradually staged a comeback bit by bit, partly due to their own growing power and increasing access to military weapons and money, but partly also due to the errors, I think most people would agree, of not just the US, but the other allied partners who have been involved in the war over there. So by now, you'd have to say that the Taliban are in the ascendant and control 40% of the land in Afghanistan already.
That's a shocking statistic, isn't it, considering the war's been going on for close to 2 decades. Right. But obviously, I mean, this is a significant story, as I say, clearly. Why have you chosen it as your story of the week, though? Because, you could have picked any moment in these negotiations over the past few years. Why now? Why is this a turning point?
I think because actually what's driving the peace talks at the moment is especially Donald Trump's desire to get a quick foreign policy victory. Trump is actually looking for a swift exit to this situation, which previous US presidents have also looked for, which is also part of the problem. But I think that Trump is actually quite serious about it, and we could see US troops, abandon's too strong a word, but leave the country. And what the ramifications of that will be, we don't really know, but I think you can predict that they're not going to be good. Okay,
Hollie, give us some predictions of ramifications then, and if they are good or not. I mean, has Donald Trump at least helped bring this to some sort of conclusion?
I feel Trump is going to help bring US troops out, but I'm not sure that's a conclusion for Afghanistan. Their sort of desperation to withdraw is maybe prompting a peace deal too soon. Whether you trust the Taliban to do as they've offered to do and how you keep that in checks checks and balances, that they're going to stop one of their promises to stop terrorists from being on Afghanistan soil, how you can prevent that.
And that seems like such a minor goal, frankly, doesn't it, in the internet age? And whether or not terrorists are literally training in your country's geographical space, if 40% of the country is run by, an organisation who are hostile to the United States, they can fund it somewhere else, can't they, even if they stuck by that?
Sure, and there's shocking figures of even when NATO pulled out in 2014, 25 Afghan police and army are dying every day since then. That's huge amounts of people dying still. So it's not, we might sit there and think the Afghan war is dwindled down, but there's huge amounts of people dying. Arion kind of stopped from using the word abandon, but that is kind of exactly what happened in the 90s. That's how the Taliban got in. The Americans left, and everyone was war weary. Afghanistan allowed the Taliban to rule, and that I feel that's history repeating itself.
And on that, Cameron, do you think the withdrawal of US troops will lead to another bloody civil war?
I think if you had asked me a year ago, I probably would have said yes, because nothing really has changed in the Taliban's leadership at that point, and obviously they've got very close ties with Al-Qaeda. However, the Taliban has a new leader, Mullah Baradar, and he has a history of wanting to chase peace talks. So I think if there is any sign that perhaps we may get peace in Afghanistan, this might be the first step.
I mean, the whole rhetoric has moved so far from George W. Bush, hasn't it? I mean, it's extraordinary, really.
Absolutely. And one of the justifications was, there were two justifications at the centre of the 2001 kickoff of the war. One was, we're going to root out terrorism, we're going to stop the people, we're going to track down and stop and kill the people who killed US citizens in the 9/11 attacks.
And that had some justification, international support for that idea.
Yeah, and the US was in touch with the Taliban and said, hand over the perpetrators and stop allowing them to operate on your soil, or we're going to invade. And the Taliban said no, and the US invaded. So that was one thing. But the other thing that the US was saying was, we're also going to liberate an entire people from the rule of the Taliban, which is very oppressive. And it's that has completely faded from view. There's no intention anymore to make things right. It really is just this headlong rush out the door. So things have moved on.
But I suppose that war, Hollie, was such a crucial determining factor in how the American population, well, actually all of the West, but the American population saw American interventionism, that in a way this was it would have to be the ultimate conclusion. It killed so many Afghanistan citizens, but also so many American soldiers, nothing like the same number, of course, but so many, and people felt it was going on so long that how could it end apart from with a withdrawal and a change in foreign policy across everything? Syria, Iraq, North Korea.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the same for the UK. I think we're a lot more reticent to go towards any other wars. Like Syria, it put Parliament off from voting to go into Syria. We saw lots of deaths too, and I think it is tragic, and people maybe need to have a look at the long-term implications, because if you do just let it go back to how it was, then there is the risk of it becoming another kind of haven for terrorists.
It's at odds with US policy elsewhere. I think that one of the things that makes this story feel as though it's come out of nowhere is that a lot of people have kind of settled into the status quo of Afghanistan. We just think that there's a certain number of US troops stationed out there, as well as NATO troops and others, and that's what is providing a bit of a backstop to prevent the country from falling into a state of chaos.
And also journalists have enabled us to think that way. They've talked about it as a generational war.
Sure.
They haven't counted on Trump saying, no, it's over.
But you think about the fact that there's still American troops deployed on the Korean Peninsula 60 years after the Korean War.
Yeah.
This is American policy allows for the idea of leaving troops in a place. They did the same thing in Japan. They did the same thing in Europe after World War II.
Well, the British are still in Cyprus, aren't we?
Right. And in a sense, you continue to have influence on that place only by leaving troops there. So the idea that you can just withdraw troops and stop a war, it's not even war anymore as it was when it began. It's just that hostilities are likely to continue with or without you in the territory.
Do you think it plays well for Trump's voters, though, domestically, Cameron? In the short term, they'll say, great, we've brought back our boys. Do you think in 5 years' time, when people are saying we need to go back again, that will be a problem?
I guess it depends how it's put across to them. If it's come back as we've done what we needed to do and we've got our boys back, then I think it will work really well for him. And again, it's another chapter that he has essentially closed in the US's history that is very grey. However, if it's kind of brushed under the carpet somewhat and the troops come back and we'll focus on something else, I think it might be considered as kind of a bit cowardly.
And also, I think it depends how long it remains a good news story. I think you're right. In the immediate aftermath of bringing your soldiers back home, you get a boost. But if 2 years later there's a terrorist attack on US soil that's traced to Afghanistan, then it doesn't look like such a clever political maneuver.
I mean, the W era was not a glorious one for American politics and foreign policy, was it? And Barack Obama tried and failed to close down Guantanamo Bay. So, Holly, I mean, at least Trump is, as on all of these issues, doing what he said he'd do. I mean, he might actually do a thing that he campaigned and said he'd do, which Obama didn't.
I'm not sure that's a standard we should hope for the US president to do what he says he's going to do. I mean, Trump can say whatever he wants, whether it's factual or not, and there'll be Trump supporters that will support that.
But you see my point. Guantanamo, was a horrible relic of the Bush era that remains open despite Obama's efforts. Trump has said, this war shouldn't have happened. What are we doing there? I'm going to end it, and he will.
I mean, sure, he is doing that, and he's sanctioning Iran, and he's doing lots of other things he said he would do, but it doesn't make the world a better place necessarily.
Tell you what I'm going to do, Holly. I'm going to go to Cameron Tait for his story of the week after this. And so finally this week, it is our very own tech head, Cameron Tait. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's time to bid farewell to the Queen of the Skies.
Now, Vicky, how would you like to fly in the 747?
Who wouldn't? Where to?
Rome, London, Paris, Tokyo, Honolulu.
You mean it? Really?
Vicky, flying the 747 is the in thing. We want to know why. Why do people prefer it? Why do the airlines like it? How does it compare with the other big jets coming up? I want interviews with all the people who are concerned here. Get your background from the Boeing people. Get interviews with stewardesses, pilots, passengers, everybody. Use a tape recorder.
I will.
That was a clip from a Boeing 747 promotional video circa 1969. Cameron, 1969. Your story of the week.
It is.
Match those concepts for us.
So, would you believe it? The Boeing 747 was released back in 1969, but that's not my story of the week. My story is that British Airways has announced that they are going to be phasing out their fleet of 747s by the year 2025.
Okay, so some people listening to this who will get a bit, I mean, they may even be listening on a British Airways 747 right now, may be getting a bit rose-tinted and nostalgic about the idea that these planes that have been around forever and people have grown up on will be phased out. But so what? I mean, that's what happens with planes, isn't it? They get old and then they get phased out. Precisely,
but I think the 747 is something that is a little bit different to kind of any other plane. If you go to an airport now and you fly somewhere to, I don't know, Italy or France, you go on a plane and you get there. But when you go across the Atlantic or you go to Asia, you know that you're going on a 747.
It's like the promotional video all over again. Take a tape recorder.
I know, it's really crazy because I was listening to these promotional videos and I thought, God, they're actually right. I wouldn't know half the planes that I go on, but as soon as you go to an airport, you can spot a 747. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's obviously got a very distinctive shape, but it really did change the way that we fly and the way that air travel went.
And are you suggesting, therefore, that the age of air travel as a kind of glamorous mainstream aspiration is dead?
Yeah, definitely. So when you had the jet age that kind of kicked off in the late 50s and early 60s, there was this definite kind of excitement coming around about getting onto a plane and travelling to new countries quickly. And then when the 747 came along, it was that, right, this is the mass appeal. We can all go on a 747. It's big, it's safe, and we can go as further than we were ever able to do before. But now that that's phasing out, what's the next step? There doesn't seem to be this kind of excitement anymore for bigger and better planes. It just seems like
is that true?
Going abroad.
Arion, you fly to Australia periodically.
I do.
Do you
fly
have excitement
Australia
for big planes?
Well, actually, my wife does. She's a huge Airbus A380 fanatic.
Now, that's the double-decker, isn't it?
It's a double-decker one.
There you go, Cameron. A380. It's a Dreamliner. People get excited about those.
Yeah,
You're wrong, basically.
But yeah, it's a huge plane. It's much more comfortable. It's much more quiet than a 747. So actually, I do feel much more excited about when I end up on one of those planes. But I spoke to our resident plane nerd, Holden Frith, who is hugely... He once actually tried to be a pilot.
I don't believe they have planes in Norwich, do they, that fly transatlantically?
It's only a matter of time with Holden at the helm. But no, he actually I think he's planning to do his pilot's license at some stage, but also just happens to be a big plane enthusiast.
What a man of mystery.
Yeah.
So many facets.
And there are a bunch of planes, he says, that are coming up to replace the 747. It's just that they're not going to be the exact same shape and size. We're going to have some that are bigger, like the A380 and the 777, which is Boeing's equivalent. But then you're going to have a bunch of smaller planes, like the A350 and the Boeing 787, that do a similar job, but just a slightly smaller scale. So there is this sort of push towards making planes more environmentally friendly and giving smaller planes a longer range so that you can send more of them more frequently to places around the world.
But also, Holly, I mean, maybe the other reason that long-haul travel seems less glamorous now, or seems like it's having less of an investment, less excitement, whatever words we're searching for, is because short-haul travel, low-budget travel, has grown, hasn't it? And apart from the environmental problems with that, obviously, that seemed to be a good thing, but also one that makes it less of a novelty when you get on a plane. If you're used to getting a plane to Edinburgh from London, it's not going to be so exciting to go to New York, maybe.
Yeah, I think generationally as well, as the younger generation get older, we're more likely to fly. So there's definitely going to continue a boom in travel. I don't think it's going to stop just because of the 747. But it was a big moment as the world became more accessible to the masses. People could suddenly fly, whereas they couldn't do that before. So it is a big moment that they're kind of going to be shelved. I find, going back to ghost towns, that there's this ghost desert where all the planes go.
There is a real one, isn't there?
There's ghost planes everywhere as well. Is
it in Nevada, I think?
I think there's one in Arizona as well.
Yeah.
I think that there's a few, but
you can kind of drive around the perimeter and have a sneaky look, but you're not allowed to go in, which makes it all the more exciting.
Very exciting. But I don't think it's the end of exciting things in aerospace either.
Right, let's talk about some exciting things in aerospace. Cameron, what is next? Let's answer your own question.
Well, there's the obvious
No,
thing.
don't give us the obvious. Tell us the future.
I'll start the obvious, which is electric planes. So,
been there, done that, talked about electric planes before.
Precisely.
Next.
So that's what I thought I'd start off with.
Yeah.
But the exciting things are, if you class as exciting, non-stop between Sydney and London is the next big thing. And I think that's what's really going to change air travel next, is getting rid of layovers, just go straight over to the next country.
In how many hours, though? Because they're not...
over 20.
Yeah. It's not supersonic.
Hours.
It's just a big plane.
It's not supersonic.
Would you do that, Arion? As someone who goes, like I say, to Australia fairly regularly, would you want to be on a 17-hour flight?
I probably would give it a go if I was in a particular rush to be someplace, but I actually quite like bouncing through, particularly because getting from London to Sydney involves going via Asia if you go one way. And yeah, I'm perfectly happy to stop off in Asia. So I think I'd probably still bounce.
Where does Arion McNicoll like to stretch his legs?
Hong Kong,
to Sydney?
Ideally.
Hong
Kong.
I can see you in Hong Kong.
Well, Arion, the way that Qantas is going to try and entice you onto one of these non-stop flights to London is by possibly offering an onboard gym, which I find bizarre because I don't think planes are big enough to have an onboard gym.
And sweaty people all on a plane together.
And could you imagine trying to sleep and you'd see some sweaty person on a bike in front of you? You'd be like, please stop, get out of the way. Anyway, but I think
a couple got chucked off a plane for having body odour this week, didn't they? I know, I'm not making it up.
Yeah, it's
true. So that could be a real problem if you've got a gym on board.
It could be. So I think that's a really interesting idea, though, is that obviously with long flights it does get extremely boring, and I have one next week that's 13 hours and I'm not looking forward to it. So if you had something on board where you could maybe go and do something, or would they ever kind of offer an actual shop where you could stand up and go to it? I don't know. Something to entertain you.
How many goods can you look at for 17 hours? You've just been through the airport.
Somewhere to... Well, you know when you live in a city, you're like, I've got to get out at some point during the day.
Some shopping.
You get up and you go to Marks & Spencer's and you realise that all the stock is exactly the same and you go back home.
That's what Cameron wants. It's not enough just having the M&S sandwiches on BA. He wants a fully fledged Marks & Spencer.
I want a shop on a plane.
Well, the alternative to that is the other proposal for the future of aviation is hypersonic planes. So you don't actually have to spend 15 hours shopping in midair, but instead the prototype that Boeing unveiled last year, which still doesn't have a name actually, but they're talking about making this hypersonic plane that can go at Mach 5, which would get you pretty much across the Atlantic in 2 hours and across the Pacific in about 3. So much less shopping time, admittedly, but yeah, that could be the other way that technology takes us.
And why? Because, I mean, Concorde shut for a reason. What's changed?
I think that they've got advances in engine technology and also a type of plane that can cruise at much higher altitude. It actually takes you up to 95,000 feet, from which vantage you can see the curvature of the Earth. So I think that the prototype, at least, is just technological advance above what the Concorde offered.
Although Concorde was, it was a real Concorde moment, it really was kind of starting to lag behind in the early 2000s. It was really loud. Whenever you heard it take off, it used to set off car alarms in the car parks because it was so noisy. The only problem with hypersonic flight, though, is that you get a sonic boom, and it's every 5 minutes. So if you're flying past the speed of sound, you get this really loud bang, and it's almost like a bomb going off. So if you've got that going up and you're going over a city, you could have really mega problems. I'm not sure whether that would change at 95,000 feet, but that's one of the reasons why Concorde stopped, is because of the sonic booms.
And because it's super expensive, right? If you're going to invest in that kind of technology, they're going to be charging $5,000 a seat.
And they're looking at small planes as well. So if you've only got like 55 people on a plane, you'd obviously have to charge thousands.
Yeah.
I have a fun fact. I was on the very last Concorde flight.
No!
Basically
Okay, well,
famous.
we're ending after this. So luxuriate in this anecdote, Holly. Tell it properly. How did that come to pass?
My mum was working on it, as she used to work on Concorde, and she was on the final flight, and they were allowed to bring one family member.
Oh.
My dad got to go to New York a few weeks before I got to go to Filton in Bristol.
Is
But
that
it
where
was
the
pretty
last flight
amazing.
went?
Yeah.
Sorry, the last flight went from where to Filton?
Heathrow.
What?
Yeah,
Why?
it flew around because we went supersonic and you're not allowed to do it over the country, so we flew around a bit and then landed in Bristol.
But why didn't it go to New York?
So that
for the
it could
final flight of
stay in
Concorde?
Bristol so you could still go and visit.
Okay, why didn't it go from New York to Bristol? Why did it go from London to Bristol? That's the shittest flight ever. I can't believe that was the farewell to Concorde. Did you get a souvenir?
I did.
What was it?
I stole some of the cutlery.
Amazing, this gets better. What did you steal?
I can't.
You can't. You've just said, you just said cutlery. You can say
get real
fork.
cutlery on Concorde as well. It's like metal and everything. In the days when everything else was plastic, it's very posh.
That's why I spent $5,000 on a ticket.
Yeah.
Metal cutlery.
That's why they couldn't afford them in the end.
I said we're ending there. We cannot top that. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to high flyer Holly Clemence, Arion McNicoll on his way to Australia, and Cameron Tait en route to M&S. Remember, you can download our entire back catalogue, more than enough for a flight to Sydney, when you subscribe. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer was Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again at Hong Kong Airport, bye-bye.